Joining us for more from London via Skype, Amar Wakaf is Managing Director of the Syria-focused think tank Knossos. Also in London, Alexander Nekrasov is a former advisor to the Russian government. From Miami, Remy Pete is a professor associate with the European Union Center at Florida International University. And with us here in the studio is John Sitilides. He is a global risk analyst with Trilogy Advisors. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Amar Wakaf, let me start with you. Well, we've been hearing lots of talk on both sides of the Atlantic about this precision strike on Syria's chemical weapons laboratories. Of course, the Syrians are saying something very different. They said no chemical weapons laboratories were hit. These buildings that were hit were something completely different. President Trump, as we just reported, said mission accomplished. So, Amar, what do you know of this mission and what, if anything, was accomplished?
Well, what we know for starters is that the mission itself was watered down from apparently the first thoughts that President Trump and his allies wanted to do. We were talking, first of all, of a multiple day multiple day sort of operation that would target military facilities, especially, airports, military airports, and so on and so forth. This has been watered down to one strike. And what we also think that this strike wasn't that successful. It would have been it would have made a lot of sense to bomb airports. And what we hear from the Russian and Syrian side is that they actually wanted to bomb airports, but a lot of the missiles, in fact, about 90% of the missiles targeting the airports have been shot down. So this corroborates sort of the Russian-Syrian side of the story that they've shot down a lot of them. So that leaves us with three distinct targets. One of them is actually like half a mile from my house in Damascus. And then my neighbors reported, a lot of black smoke in the area. Thankfully, it wasn't a chemical weaponry facility. Otherwise, a lot of people would have been dead.
Right.
So that's what we understand. So watered down and most probably not as successful as the West says.
John, let's look at this action. This is very serious action. This is essentially an act of war against a sovereign nation. Some commentators have been saying that this was ceremonial. It was had no significant military aim. What did you make of it?
I think quite the contrary, actually. There was an almost perfect equilibrium of sending the right message to the Hafez Assad regime that the West and the quote-unquote international community where one exists in trying to enforce international agreements cannot allow the red line on chemical and biological weapons use. That's why I think Prime Minister May was talking about how this was a very focused mission. It was to send a message, these red lines cannot be crossed. I do think, however, that, and reports are that John Bolton may have been recommending a stronger strike, maybe along the lines of what your guest just began to describe. Right. And the idea was that we want to make sure that nothing is done there that might trigger a Russian escalation on the military front, so that it's focused enough on Hafez Assad, sends the right message there, keeps the Russians to the side, but also, very importantly, from a geographic region, and we'll talk about this some more over the next few minutes, I'm sure, a shot across the bow to Iran. Right. Nothing that the U.S. is doing in Syria is being done without an eye towards Iran and how they'll see the kind of signals that we're sending, especially with their kind of regional aggression, their drones near Israel in recent weeks and the last 2 months and the like. So there's a much wider application here in addition to maintaining the red line on chem bio use.
But John, as I pointed out, this is, it's an act of war. Wouldn't it be absolutely incumbent on those nations carrying out this attack to provide incontrovertible evidence that these chemical weapons do exist and that is why we are taking this action? We haven't seen that.
Ideally, that would be the case, but we're not dealing with a court of law here. And I think the degree to which the United States, the British, and the French intelligence agencies have, as we would call it, a supremely high degree of confidence, that's how these very difficult decisions are made. Unfortunately, it's what they have to go on, and it'll be very difficult to see how they would have ratified a decision along these lines unless it really was at the highest levels. Hopefully not a repeat of what happened in '03 with Iraq. Right. And I think that's going to be the danger here. But we'll see how this plays out in the days and weeks ahead as inspectors have access to the bombed sites.
Okay, let me go to Remy Pete in Miami. And Remy, the last time there was an attack of this kind, it was just the United States, which acted alone. Now the United States has the support, military support, of both France and the United Kingdom. How significant is that the United States was joined by its two European allies?
Obviously, it's very important because you do not want to be one power acting unilaterally without any kind of support from another, especially members of the P5 at the United Nations. But I think the second panelist stated perfectly, is the idea is here to find the right balance between acting where you actually have the use of chemical weapon, which was a red line for the three countries, and trying not to create any kind of reasons for retaliation from the Russians and the Iranians if you actually create some collateral damages or victims if you were to strike an airport or a military base where you do have some militaries from either Russia or Iran being staged there. So the idea here was to be able to do something different than 2013, where there was actually a very reduced answer, and the capacity of Great Britain and Cameron, especially in London, to get the support from his own parliament to strike in Syria after the use of the first wave of chemical weapon. Here, the idea was to try to move forward as quick as possible, and unfortunately, that also goes with a lack of democracy and lack of support from your own parliamentary members to be able to act.
Okay, let's go back to London to Alexander Nekrasov. And Alexander, Russia, of course, is deeply involved in Syria. It has troops on the ground in that country. What is your view of what happened here?
Well, first of all, I think that the whole crisis has become much wider than just one Syria. I think the increasingly autocratic governments of the West are playing political games here because this is a part of the campaign, which is part of the standoff with Russia, because already we are discussing Syrian attack, but already a new wave of anti-Russian campaign is on, and now Russia is accused of hacking, millions of people and millions of government departments and so on. So we are seeing wave after wave after wave of attacks on Russia in propaganda war. So when we talk about these strikes, the first thing that comes to mind, why before the inspectors went there? Why did they rush, and why are they now playing games with these inspectors and claiming falsely that they are not allowed by the Syrians and Russians to go there, when it is a blatant lie, when it is misinformation on a scale which in this situation is provoking more tension, more danger, and so on. So I think these governments have overstepped the line themselves, because they were actually prepared to start World War III while hiding behind humanitarian consideration. Now let me ask you this. What would have happened if the Russians, the Iranians, and the Chinese, for example, on invitations of Moscow, struck airfields in Saudi Arabia from humanitarian point of view, saying that they're killing innocent civilians, as we speak, by the way, every day in Yemen with the Western munitions? Now, how would that have been treated by the so-called people, humanitarians in Washington, Paris, and London, who are now lying to us that they care about the Syrians? No, it would have been considered an aggression, an act of war, and basically an invitation to World War III. So this, I stress again, these are authoritarian Western regimes losing their mind. That's what is happening.
Okay, John, go ahead.
I think we just have to be careful about these types of analogies, because I don't see any type of international activity to prescribe military action. I mean, Syria now is a complete wasteland after 6 or 7 years of war, and there's not been an intervention to stop those kinds of activities by Hafez Assad, exclusive of chem bio. So the idea that anybody would strike Saudi Arabia for humanitarian reasons without Saudi having violated an international agreement doesn't fit the analogy here. So I think that's very important to keep in mind here. It was a strictly chem bio reaction. If it wasn't for that strike, there would not have been a response from the West.
Okay, Amar Wakaf, I just want to clarify something on the status of the chemical weapons inspectors here. Are they going to be allowed to get to the site in Douma to see what's on the ground there?
We understand that they're going to be allowed on Wednesday. That's what the latest announcement has made clear. So apparently they're preparing something, most probably with regards to the security of the area itself, and allowing them to work in the safest environment as possible, in a sense. The other issue that we need to remember here that the Syrian government and its Russian ally were the ones who actually called for these inspectors to come as soon as possible. The Syrian government sent a letter to OPCW to invite the team without really passing through the UN Security Council. So in a sense, they were quite eager for them to come as soon as possible. And we need also to remember that those inspectors were kept in Beirut for 24 hours before being allowed into Syria so that the strikes actually take place.
Right.
But I want to go back to something that was mentioned. Well, first of all, it's not Hafiz al-Assad, it's Bashar al-Assad, his son. And second of all, I don't think Saudi Arabia, going back to finish that analogy, is doing anything legal in Yemen. It's also an aggression, and if we take the United States' presence in Syria at the moment, we understand that there is like 2,000 combat troops and 3,000 contractors. It's not necessarily legal as well. It's a sort of aggression. It's a sort of occupation as well. Arming rebellions against a sovereign state is an act of aggression in its own right, proxy war, and so on and so forth. A lot of all this is illegal. Actually, none of it is legal. So adding with a strike here or two there, it's not going to, change the situation. It's all illegal.
Remy Pete, let's look at public opinion in France. President Emmanuel Macron has tried to defend his action on Monday. Let's listen to what he had to say.
This intervention took place within a legitimate framework, and as I was at pains to point out before, during, and afterwards, is in no way an attack on the Syrian regime or its allies, but an attack which resulted from evidence on the ground that chemical weapons had been used against the civilian population by Bashar al-Assad's regime. Within that context, this operation changes nothing of our collective strategy in Syria.
So, Remy, do you see a strategy here? When the French president says this was not an attack on the Syrian government, what does that mean? You attacked a sovereign nation. You attacked Syria.
Well, what he's trying to say is that the attack was actually launched not specifically for specific policies from one part in a conflict or a sovereign leader in Bashar al-Assad. It was specifically linked to the chemical weapon strike, and that it was impossible for Macron to not act because there was such a clear line in the sand that should not be crossed. And when it was crossed and nobody actually had any reaction, it was then condemned for not doing anything. Now, I'd like to there's two interesting points that needs to be made, both in terms of public opinion and legality. The main element is that, unfortunately, the main victim of the last few years is the Syrian people itself, and the fact that the situation at United Nations with different P5 members ready to use their veto power every time there's a resolution, one sense or another, paralyzes any kind of international orchestrated answers to try to settle the dispute. In terms of public opinion, what's true is that each of the three members of the strike, whether it's Donald Trump, Theresa May, or Emmanuel Macron, had something to gain in terms of their own public opinion by acting. Donald Trump wanted to be seen as someone that acts in comparison with Obama that was not able to strike 2013. Macron is facing some large strikes in France and is more than happy to move away the agenda of French media towards Syria and the strikes in Syria. Well, Theresa May is also facing a large series of issues domestically. But that doesn't move away from the fact that there had to be, to their perspective, there had to be something to be done from the chemical weapon. And unfortunately, the collective action to the United Nations system is actually broken.
There is also a view in the United States that Donald Trump carried out this attack at that very time on Friday evening to deflect attention away from the publication of a very controversial book by a former FBI director. We've heard that as well. But I'm going to go back to Alexander right now. Alexander, you're in London. There was a very rowdy session in the British Parliament today in which the British Prime Minister, Theresa May, offered this explanation. Let's watch.
Let me be absolutely clear. We have acted because it is in our national interest to do so. It is in our national interest to prevent the further use of chemical weapons in Syria and to uphold and defend the global consensus that these weapons should not be used. for we cannot allow the use of chemical weapons to become normalised, either within Syria, on the streets of the UK or elsewhere. So we have not done this because President Trump asked us to do so. We have done it because we believed it was the right thing to do, and we are not alone.
Alexander, was that a convincing argument, a convincing statement from Theresa May?
Well, it's part of the farce that started in Salisbury. And I must say that I wasn't expecting much to happen in the Commons because the whole debate was twisted inside out to suit the government. The point should have been not whether Parliament was allowed to debate or not, because it didn't really matter. It was not an invasion. It was a one-off strike, so Parliament didn't matter here. The point was, why didn't they wait for the evidence? Just like why didn't they wait for the evidence in the so-called poisoning in Salisbury? And I can tell you why it is happening. Because immediately today, already in the evening, they started another campaign, as I said, against Russia, accusing it of cyber attacks against Britain. And they're doing it because the May's government is in terrible trouble. It has lost the talks about Brexit with the EU. It has basically betrayed the nation. And this scandal, which is, by the way, going on with many, many other scandals, which are very dangerous for May, her government could have been toppled, could have been impeached. So she is going to continue this game. And what she's been saying in Parliament, it makes no sense at all. And this farcical debate, which this is fake Britain at its best, with its fake democracy at its best. They accuse other nations of lack of democracy, tolerance, and so on. They themselves are playing a farce which is so embarrassing that people who see me on television, and I appear on television a lot in Britain, they come to me on the streets and say, we are ashamed of our government. We are embarrassed, all these lies against Russia to cover up their own sins.
Okay. John, you want to respond to that?
I do. I think the Trump administration is trying to be as careful as it can in dealing with Russia. And President Trump has made very clear, despite all the political controversy of the last 2 years, that he very much respects Vladimir Putin as the leader of Russia and is looking still to see, with all of these differences and now a strike against Russia's ally Syria, that he's still looking for ways to at least make sure the relationship doesn't become any worse than it already is, at a very low point. And first, they talked about, Nikki Haley at the UN talked about the potential for additional sanctions over the weekend after the strike.
Well, that's been rolled back.
And President Trump basically flipped earlier today and said, no, that's not where we're going. We're going to look to see what the Russian parliament does between now and May 15th, decide what actions they take, and then we'll see how we respond in kind.
Okay, but John, looking at U.S. strategy, there is a broader question here. When you look at this war in Syria, this civil war, it broadly pits the Syrian government and Syrian government forces against a wide array of rebel forces. Now, when you have an attack like this, which essentially hurts the Syrian government, are you not giving comfort to those attacking that government?
I don't know that it hurts the Syrian government. And again, that's where the precision strikes are so important. They targeted 3 facilities. The major one was the Scientific Research Center that produces chemical and biological weapons. Damascus is intact. Assad is alive. There was no actual attack on him, or for that matter, any of his military forces that keep destroying the rest of the country, which is why I want to just keep emphasizing, however one wants to argue whether this is right or wrong, it was very targeted and sent very deliberate messages. But the war will continue, unfortunately, and it'll include Russia and Turkey and the Kurds and the Iranians and the Israelis and the Americans, and there's really still no end in sight, unfortunately.
Let me get Amar Wakaf's view on this. Amar Wakaf, as John says, this was not an attack on the Syrian government. This was an attack on this chemical weapons facility. If that was the case, does this not, in a way, give these rebels license to raise these false flags, to say that, you know, there was an attack here, a chemical weapons attack, which they themselves can stage, to invite an attack on Syria?
Very much so. Anybody could stage any attack within a closed environment. We don't even have to see any scenery to ascertain which place it took place in. You know, you could do it in Idlib and say this was in Dar'a. Nobody would check. The fact that actually the United States, the United Kingdom, and France chose to strike before the OPCW team conducts even any, let alone have any results of the investigation, tells you that they are actually they actually have very much doubts that there was probably an attack, or at least the OPCW coming out with anything. So that's one thing. Second, this has got nothing, let us remember, this has got nothing to do with any chemical attacks or anything that the Syrian government has done or will do. This is about the Western powers being defensive, with Russia really advancing in influence in the Middle East, and they're trying to salvage. So I would say that and this actually explains the reason why they're not very confident in what they're trying to do. They want to have any sort of claim of chemical attacks without any evidence whatsoever, and get away with any strike just to give the initiative to themselves or regain some initiatives.
Right.
And they're trying now to translate that initiative into pressing with the Syrian political process, saying, well, we're going to put some pressure on Russia to revitalize the Geneva process and so on and so forth. But we don't think that's going to happen.
Okay. Remy, Pete, what's your view on that? Is this attack part of an effort by Western powers to put the brakes on Russian influence in the Middle East?
I mean, putting the brake on Russian influence is just to be back on the map and actually be active and providing some kind of an answer to what they see as a chemical attack from Bashar al-Assad. So not being able to be taxed as being, responseless in those situations. Now, clearly, there was a clear attempt to limit potential externalities on Russia, on Iran. The decision from Trump not to increase sanctions on Russia also shows that the objective was to provide a targeted answer specifically on nuclear facilities. Do the Western power want to be back on the map and try to relaunch and pressure Russia into some type of concerted peace agreement, such as the Geneva negotiations today? They would like to, but let's be honest, the situation has moved forward right now. We're not in 2013 anymore. Bashar al-Assad has, as a matter of fact, really moved forward and probably won the war already.
Okay.
And there's no situation where you can actually be curving the power positions.
Okay, I have 1 minute left, and I want to get 30 seconds from each of you. John, you first.
I wonder about the validity of questioning the inspectors and when that inspection is going to be taking place. We'd have to believe that the United States, the United Kingdom, and France are willing to risk their international reputations to strike at this research center and 2 other sites, and then have the inspectors go to this neighborhood, the suburb of Damascus, and find no culpability on the part of the Syrian government. It's extraordinarily difficult to imagine that the governments would agree to this kind of a strike knowing they'd be exposed to having, quote unquote, completely lied.
Alexander, I've got 10 seconds. In fact, the Kremlin spokesman, Dmitry Peskov, said this was, what did he call it? He called it an asset grab, this attack. What did you make of it?
No, I think it was an attack against Syria, but also an attack against Russia. I think it was an opportunist act. It mirrors the Iraqi war, the destruction of Libya, and I can't understand how it's not against Syria or not against Assad. I can't understand the logic at all.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's all we have time for. I'm Arend Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.